PowerPoint introduces you to the methodology for calculating child support payments. You can expect to be doing this on your final exam and throughout your family law practice. First, let's start to think a little bit about the framework here. We want to think, when we're considering how child support might be structured, we want to think first about who is going to get support, through what age will adult children with disabilities be counted. We want to consider what counts as income, how inclusive will we be, and is it just your salary, or might it include military benefits or lottery winnings? We want to think about when our child support payments begin and when they end. Do they begin at birth? Do they begin in pregnancy? Do they end at 18, after college? We want to think about where you might go to modify. If we're talking about a potential 18-year commitment, we might imagine state-to-state moves and interesting jurisdictional questions. And then the question most on the minds of many of our clients is how much support will be awarded. Throughout all of this, I want you to keep asking the question, why this system? This is an incredibly policy-driven framework that is dripping with values and judgments about the child, what the state is communicating to families. So think critically throughout. We have sort of a who, what, when, where kind of approach, but I want that why to be underlying everything you learn about child support. We could introduce this with considerations about the parent and considerations about the state. In other portions of our course, we will wrestle with really interesting questions of who counts as a parent. Is it only biological parents? Is it a step parent? Can it be more than two? Is it limited to only two? Is functional parenting the same for the purposes of child support calculations? And we might also stop and consider interesting questions about the role of the state. Is it the federal government that's going to drive this? Is it the state government that's going to drive this? How are we going to fund child support? Is it going to be entirely private, or will we back it up with state funds? What kinds of strings might be attached if the state and federal government are working together? Or what kind of strings might be attached to parents who get child support? All sorts of interesting policy questions. The column on the left, our parents column will really be addressed in parentage, but I want you to see here the intersection of who is a parent and the support function come together. And the column on the right is much more what we will focus on in this unit. As we think about how we might frame a system for managing child support, I want you to think here, you can almost frame this in like straight up Goldilocks terms, between, on the one hand, a system that we have now, which is incredibly driven by mandatory frameworks, presumptive amounts, such that the award that might be granted in Kentucky wouldn't be different in structure from an award that would be granted in Maryland. It wouldn't be different in one county from a neighboring county, and it should apply the exact same to families with 3 children, regardless of where you live. So we have an incredible mandatory framework. That should catch your attention in this course particularly. Almost everything we've studied to date has given the court a fair amount of discretion to fashion customized judgment. That is not the child support framework that our families will operate under in our representation. On the other extreme, a discretionary framework is what we historically had. A discretionary framework would say, well, each family court judge should fashion an award as to what is just and reasonable. But the problem with that is one judge might say that 2 children require $700 a month as reasonable child support, and another might say that those same 2 children in a different jurisdiction require $1,700 a month. And so how do we manage fairness across jurisdictions in a discretionary framework, but how do we handle the bluntness of a mandatory framework, which is more what we have today on the left? All right, buckle your seatbelts, guys. We are going to practice some math. So I'm going to model for you, what I'm demonstrating here is the income shares model. This is the dominant approach used in most states throughout the country, and it is the approach you will be tested on your final exam, the income shares model. Later in this presentation, I will contrast this with a different model so you can get a sense of how other states work. First, we're going to calculate the monthly gross income of the two parents. Then we're going to figure out what percentage each of those parents contributes. If they make, one parent makes 70% and the other parent makes 30% of the total. We're going to look for any offsets or adjustments to those monthly totals. Then we're going to use a chart, and every single one of us is going to come to the same number on that chart once we look up our monthly income for the number of children, and the answer wherever you are in your state will be the same. Then we will reapply those percentages. So if one parent makes 70% and the other makes 30%, then the 70% parent will pay 70% of the respective child support share and the other 30%. Then we will pause and look for any deviations, any reasons why we have some sort of extraordinary set of circumstances that suggest we shouldn't follow the mandatory presumptive award. So first step, we calculate income. The two things I want to say about this is whatever you could possibly think of as income likely counts as income. I have a substantial list here: salaries, wages, commissions, bonuses, severance, prizes, gift, including alimony that you might get from your ex or some sort of support, all counts. The only thing that does not count as income for the purposes of calculating child support are benefits received from means-tested public assistance programs. So not things like disability benefits, not things like military benefits, those would all count. Only things that are based on means, like food stamps, would be excluded from our very inclusive, very broad definition of income. Then we figure out what the two parents' collective monthly income is. So you'll see here, I have some numbers here for you, and I want you to actually pause the video when I'm done explaining the task, and pause the video and actually calculate this. You'll see it involves two steps. One, making sure that all the numbers that you're working with are monthly numbers. I might give you weekly or annual or monthly, and then adding the total up. So pause the video and calculate what is the gross monthly income of parent 1 and what is the gross monthly income of parent 2. Now, after you have calculated the gross monthly income of parent 1 or parent 2, you should figure out, of the total, what percentage is attributed to parent 1 and what percentage is attributed to parent 2. Please pause the video and calculate that number as well. So you should have determined that spouse 1, or parent 1 more accurately, makes 71.5% of the monthly income, and parent 2, or spouse 2 in the case of a divorce, has 28.5% of the total monthly income. This should already catch our attention, and the fact that the word spouse is here should already catch your attention, because what you see happening here is a system that is set up to create an economic unit between two individuals, to say that whatever one parent makes is going to affect what they pay their child relative to what the other parent makes. So if the other parent starts to make more, the second parent might owe less. And so they're treated as one economic unit. And when we think about that from the perspective coming out of marriage, like a child support award that is attached at the moment of divorce, treating the two as an economic unit throughout the course of that child through to adulthood might make great policy sense. But do we agree with that approach if we're talking outside of marriage, if we're talking about two parents who've never actually functioned as an economic unit, but the state will treat the two as an economic unit for child support purposes? Then for step 3, we will stop and look for any offsets or adjustments. Adjustments are things we're going to subtract from the monthly income. And so we might subtract two things: pre-existing child support or pre-existing alimony. So if you are a payor, and you can read this rule as somewhat Cinderellian, if you already have children and you already support them and you pay $500 a month to those children. You will subtract that out, and for the purposes of the next group of children, those that we're considering here, we will pretend that you make $500 less a month than you do. So this is a sort of first family first approach where we make the first children or spouses whole, and then we consider with that new adjusted income what your obligation will be to your remaining subsequent children. Then you go to the statutory guidelines in your home state, and they look the same. The numbers do differ from state to state, but the approach is identical. And so you'll look on the statutory guidelines for your presumptive award based on the number of children in the family. So here we're going to assume 3 children, and we're going to just take a moment to orient ourselves to a child support guideline. Notably, there is no zero. So we don't start with the idea that someone who makes $0 a month owes $0 in child support. You'll see that right off the bat, that should flag your attention for critique and reflection from a law reform standpoint. But then we're going to move down and we're going to look. So if the number was $11,666, we're going to look up $11,600. And we know that that's the combined monthly adjusted income. And we know that the couple has 3 children. So we move over in our columns, and the presumptive award that the state guidelines have declared as the appropriate amount to raise 3 children in this state is $2,029. Then we apply that $2,029. We take that number and we keep the respective share of each parent, and we apply that to the percentage to the overall monthly award. So if the monthly award was $2,029, spouse 1 owes 71.5% of that, and spouse 2 owes 28.5%. You can see again this tension. When we think about it like spouses, it seems like a very fair system, or a more fair system. But if we think about this like children coming out of a marriage in which the 2 parents have always retained separate economic lives, this approach is subject to a lot more critique. Then this previous award is our presumptive award. Every judge in any county would get the same result for the same monthly income and the same number of children. So it brings consistency, it promotes settlement, lots of great things to celebrate. Then we do allow a small moment at the end of the analysis where we might be able to consider a deviation. A deviation would be a reason to do something other than what this result demanded. If a deviation is adopted, the judge has to put the deviation in writing. The explanation has to begin with a statement of what this, again, presumptive award would have granted. And then ideally a presumption, the statement has to explain what reasons support an adjustment. Usually it requires some sort of showing that applying the guidelines would be unjust or inappropriate, although the parties could privately agree to do more, or privately agree as well. You couldn't privately agree to forego child support, but you might agree to this amount or more. Each individual state statute is going to provide all sorts of interesting questions that go beyond the scope of our first introduction to child support, but you'll see things about how to handle shared custody, health insurance, child care costs and expenses, general medical care expenses, the tax treatment of paying and receiving child support. So this is a very important statutory area that family law lawyers will become quite familiar with in practice. In contrast, I have demonstrated the income shares model. Just note for a brief moment the percentage of income model, particularly looking at the difference of marital parentage and non-marital parentage. In contrast, the percentage of income model is adopted in 7 states, and these 7 states start by identifying each parent's taxable income. Then they subtract from that a living allowance to say, hey, before you put a roof over the head of your child, you might need a roof over your own head. And so each parent then is treated individually. And so we might get to the same result of the 70% and the 30%, but each parent gives a percentage of their income based on the number of children. So it's basically 2 calculations instead of 1. But that might matter because in our existing income shares model, for the lesser earning spouse, we haven't created a great incentive to improve that spouse's economic position, because the more the second parent makes, the more in child support he or she will pay. But here, each parent is treated equally. If you increase your income, you will pay more child support and the child will benefit. There are lots of strengths and weaknesses of both of these models, but the percentage of income model is notably stronger for providing a living allowance first. And we'll see lots of critiques in this unit about the economic implications of the income shares model and the way in which it can create grave economic peril for the non-custodial parent. There are still some of the same critiques about how high up on the scale we would go. What if you keep making more and more and more money and both parents keep doing it? Does that mean the child continues to reap the benefits? It's often called the 2-pony critique or the 1-pony rule, to say at some point, does all of our wealth have to transfer down to our children, or at some point is 1 pony enough and you don't really need 2 ponies? Both are critiqued for the minimums that they impose on families. Finally, I want to offer just a couple brief notes about child support enforcement. This is one of my favorite political cartoons depicting the Virgin Mary and the child support enforcement office in her face saying, "You're going to have to tell me who the real father is if it's not the guy standing next to you here." And child support enforcement is an incredibly critiqued area. The role of the state here is very powerful. On one side, you'll see strong critiques from the recipients of child support saying that the payors are not paying and the state is not doing enough to ensure enforcement. On the other side, you'll see incredibly strong classed and racialized narratives suggesting that when a parent interfaces with public benefits, the enforcement mechanisms are much stronger and the power of the state becomes much stronger than a family that might not be receiving public benefits, and the ways in which enforcement occurs can therefore have classed implications. There are, and the book talks about this much more substantially, so make sure you capture this from your reading, but there are criminal, federal, and state penalties for the non-payment of child support. You can be in criminal contempt, you can be in civil contempt, lots of robust consequences for non-payment. There's also lots of non-criminal punitive measures. Here's an article talking about how parents in New York are getting the boot on their car. And we can ask ourselves critically, does this actually help children? Does it do something to induce payment, or does it further economically complicate the child and the parent? We also can wage a robust critique of the ways in which we shame and stigmatize non-payors. We can look at class difference, gender difference, race difference, in the ways in which this is an example of a posting. You could see these in your local post office. You could see them in your newspapers. The kind of shaming that we do of non-payment. The state child support offices play a substantial role. So the program that I've described and the federal mandatory framework that I described, particularly back in my slide on mandatory versus discretionary, that's all coming from the federal government. But the state local offices have robust services to find non-custodial parents. And if you want to receive public benefits for your child, they will demand that you identify any information you have to help find and locate the other parent and to establish paternity in an effort to avoid the state coffers supporting the child and instead to seek private recoupment. Our state child support offices will do work to create a support order if one didn't exist, even if the other parent didn't want one, and to enforce that. So once you put your child in the path to receive public benefits, the state plays a much stronger role in establishing and enforcing, and the state might even play a role seeking modification. If you're not interfacing with public benefits, there's much more autonomy for the recipient of the child support payment to decide whether to seek enforcement or modification. So what now? This is a robust unit. It's probably one of the most important units that we study because you can really pull the curtains back and see the power of the state at work here. So as you move forward in the exercises to come, you will practice applying the calculations that we've studied. As you do so, keep critically analyzing and reflecting on the power of the state in families, looking rigorously for any unfairness or disparities or inequalities that you might see and study, and think, how might we do this differently? What might a reform look like? So this introduces you to your robust unit to come on child support calculations and enforcement.